At 30,000 feet over Japan, American bombers operated in airspace where interception was never meant to be possible. Japanese pilots looked upward and understood that the sky itself had turned against them. June 1944. Across the Western Pacific, the war shifted quietly but decisively. On newly seized airfields throughout the Marianas, American engineers worked without pause, laying down concrete runways longer than anything Japan had ever constructed. From the surface, it appeared routine. Another island taken, another base built. Yet in the thin atmosphere high above those islands, something entirely new was taking shape. The weapon was not a new fighter. It was not a faster interceptor. It was altitude. When the first B-29 Superfortress units arrived, Japanese intelligence struggled to make sense of what they observed. These aircraft were immense, far larger than the B-17s that had devastated Europe. They demanded specialized hangars, unique equipment, and vast logistical support just to remain operational. But size alone did not reveal their true role. That answer existed above 30,000 feet. Until 1944, Japanese air defense doctrine rested on assumptions formed years earlier. War in the air, they believed, would be decided by pilots, by skill, maneuverability, and fighting spirit. Combat was expected to occur within sight, at altitudes where fighters could climb, turn, and contest position. Bombers were targets to be intercepted, disrupted, and destroyed before reaching their objectives. That belief had held until it no longer did. The B-29 was never intended to meet Japan's fighters on equal terms. It was built to bypass them entirely. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to function at heights where oxygen-deprived pilots struggled simply to remain conscious. Advanced turbo-supercharged engines, driven by the massive Wright R-3350, kept the aircraft stable and efficient in air, so thin that many interceptors lost effectiveness. Defensive guns were remotely operated, tied into centralized fire control systems that adjusted for speed, distance, and altitude. Above all, the B-29 did not need to descend. When Japanese radar stations detected approaching formations, the altitude readings made little sense. At first, operators suspected malfunctioning equipment. No bomber force was expected to fly so high, so steadily, for such long durations. Fighters were launched regardless, pilots sprinting to their machines, engines roaring as they strained upward. But climb rates are finite, and physics is indifferent to resolve. Japanese interceptors, already near the limits of their performance, began to suffocate. Engines lost power. Controls grew heavy. Pilots reached heights where merely holding level flight was a challenge, let alone attacking large, fast bombers. Beneath them, the B-29s pressed on, undisturbed. This was not a collapse of courage. It was the collapse of expectation. Japan had designed its air defenses to contest access. The United States chose instead to deny engagement. From the American standpoint, the reasoning was precise and unsentimental. Greater altitude meant reduced exposure to anti-aircraft fire. It limited interception opportunities. It preserved formation integrity, improved bombing methods, and allowed crews to survive missions that would have been deadly at lower levels. From the Japanese perspective, it was deeply unsettling. Early interception reports spoke less of terror than of frustration. Pilots described watching contrails they could never reach, seeing bombers cross the sky without ever entering a viable firing position, returning to base after doing everything their training demanded, only to discover it had never mattered. The sky itself had become enemy territory. By mid-1944, the air war over Japan was no longer fought through duels and dogfights. It unfolded in vertical layers, with altitude replacing maneuver. Japanese doctrine, built around battles that required contact, now faced an opponent that did not need it. And this was only the start. At this point, the bombing campaign remained experimental. Tactics would shift. Altitudes would be adjusted. Firebombing would eventually supplant precision attacks. Yet the first shock, the realization that the enemy could operate beyond reach, left a scar that never fully healed. Japan had prepared to defend its skies. What it had not prepared for was an enemy that refused to fight there at all. Welcome to WW2 Forgotten Fronts, a channel dedicated to the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the hidden machines that shaped the Second World War. Here we dive beyond the famous headlines to uncover stories buried in diaries, lost archives, and forgotten front lines. If you're passionate about deep storytelling, real wartime experiences, and cinematic history, you've just found your new home. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. In Tokyo, early after-action reports were difficult to reconcile. Bombs were landing, damage assessments were accumulating. Yet interception figures remained puzzlingly low. On paper, Japan still fielded fighters capable of operating at high altitude. Aircraft such as the Ki-44 and modified versions of the Ki-61 possessed theoretical climb ceilings sufficient to engage heavy bombers. But theory disintegrates under sustained operations, fatigued pilots, and engines forced beyond their limits. The issue was not that Japanese fighters were unable to climb high enough. The issue was that they were unable to fight there. At extreme altitude, the rules changed. Engines overheated while producing less power. Ballistics became erratic. Control surfaces responded slowly. Pilots lost peripheral vision, fine motor skills, and situational awareness long before reaching the bomber formations. And the B-29 crews understood this. From inside pressurized cabins, American bombardiers observed Japanese fighters climbing from below, small, dark silhouettes struggling upward through thin air. Some attackers fired long, ineffective bursts before stalling. Others never closed to firing distance at all. A handful attempted ramming attacks, not as acts of fanaticism, but as expressions of tactical desperation. For Japan's air defense planners, this represented a reversal of every principle learned since the 1930s. They had invested heavily in pilot training, lengthy, demanding, elite. They had prioritized maneuverability and individual combat skill. They had assumed that any bomber could be challenged if a fighter could reach it. The B-29 invalidated that belief by redefining what reach truly meant. Interception was no longer about arrival, it was about endurance. American bombers did not make quick penetrations. They cruised, they loitered, they returned again and again, compelling repeated scrambles that drained fuel stocks, strained engines, and exhausted pilots before effective contact was even possible. Each failed interception carried consequences. Fuel shortages deepened. Maintenance queues expanded. Aircraft grounded for minor faults accumulated on airfields. Pilots surviving repeated high-altitude climbs reported headaches, blurred vision, and delayed reactions, conditions no amount of training could solve. Japan was losing capability without losing planes. At the same time, American planners analyzed results with methodical detachment. They identified altitudes associated with the lowest interception rates. They tracked engine failures among Japanese fighters. They refined bomber formations to maximize mutual defense while reducing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The campaign was not simply destroying cities. It was probing limits. This transition, from contesting airspace to exploiting performance boundaries, signaled a fundamental evolution in air warfare. It was no longer necessary to annihilate enemy fighters in large numbers. It was sufficient to force a losing choice: climb until ineffective, or remain grounded and surrender the sky. Japanese pilots felt this imbalance acutely. Post-war memoirs describe not fear, but helplessness. Pilots knew the bombers were coming. They knew the routes. They knew the timing. Yet they were powerless to intervene. The enemy was visible, predictable, and unreachable all at once. That combination was psychologically crushing. Traditional air combat at least preserved a sense of agency, the belief that skill and judgment could influence outcomes. High-altitude interception removed that agency entirely. The outcome was decided before takeoff, before contact, before a single round was fired. Japan's leadership recognized the emergency, but viable solutions were scarce. New interceptor projects were proposed. Engine improvements were rushed. Oxygen systems were revised. But development timelines could not match operational reality. Each month of bombing further weakened the industrial base needed to implement future answers. Altitude had become a strategic weapon, and the United States was only beginning to use it. Soon, American commanders would pose a dangerous question. If altitude reduced interception, what else might it allow? The answer would transform the bombing campaign and Japan's cities in ways not yet fully imaginable. By late summer 1944, the pattern could no longer be dismissed. American bombers were not exploiting weaknesses in Japan's air defenses. They were simply flying over them. For years, Japanese air doctrine had rested on a core conviction: air combat was a test of skill. The pilot who climbed faster, turned tighter, and fired first would prevail. This belief had paid dividends early in the war, particularly against adversaries bound by rigid formations and uneven training. The B-29 offered no duel. It posed a dilemma. Japan's air defense network was designed around engagement. Fighters were assigned sectors. Radar stations tracked incoming aircraft. Interceptors were launched to climb, intercept, and attack before bombers reached their targets. All of it relied on a single assumption: that combat would occur within a usable performance envelope. The B-29 removed that envelope. At 30,000 feet and higher, Japanese doctrine ceased to function. Fighters that could theoretically reach those heights arrived late, unstable, and already drained. Pilots attempting conventional attack profiles found their aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. Weapons effective at lower altitude lost reliability. Even coordination failed. By the time interceptors reached bomber altitude, the bombing run was often already finished. This revealed a deeper weakness. Japan's doctrine had been shaped for tactical encounters, not for denial at the system level. The United States was no longer concerned with defeating Japanese fighters. It was questioning whether engagement was necessary at all. Japanese planners tried to adjust. Directives emphasized climb rate over maneuverability. Pilots were told to abandon turning fights in favor of head-on attacks. Proposals emerged for specialized high-altitude units using lighter airframes and reduced armament. But adaptation met hard limits. Japan was short of fuel. It was short of time, and increasingly, it was short of engines capable of sustained high-altitude operation. Every attempt to push fighters higher imposed a price. Engine failures increased. Airframes suffered stress fractures. Pilots endured mounting physical strain without pressurization or advanced oxygen systems. Even when interceptors reached bomber altitude, attack opportunities lasted only seconds. American crews noticed the change. Bomber gunners reported fewer sustained engagements. Attacks were brief, scattered, and poorly coordinated. Fighters appeared alone or in small groups rather than organized formations. The danger remained, but its structure had broken down. This was not attrition as traditionally understood. Japanese fighters were not being destroyed in large numbers. Their effectiveness was being stripped away. It became a war fought in margins. Each mission consumed fuel Japan could not replenish. Each scramble exhausted pilots who had no time to recover. Each failed interception reinforced the reality that the system itself was mismatched to the fight. From the American viewpoint, this validated a strategic theory. High-altitude bombing was more than a technical achievement. It was a way to attack doctrine instead of hardware. By operating beyond expected limits, the B-29 forced Japan to respond with capabilities it did not have and solutions it could not implement quickly enough. The consequences reached beyond the air war. Bomb-damaged factories could not produce improved fighters. Disrupted transportation delayed fuel and spare parts. Training pipelines were shortened, turning out less experienced pilots, further degrading interception capability. The air defense system began consuming itself in an effort to keep up. Japanese pilots experienced this erosion firsthand. Accounts from the period speak of mounting futility. Pilots did not fear combat. They were frustrated by its absence. They climbed, searched, strained their aircraft, and returned without contact. The enemy existed only as distant contrails and falling bombs. That psychological strain mattered. Air defense depends on confidence as much as machinery. When pilots believe interception is possible, they push harder and take risks. When they believe it is pointless, hesitation sets in. Scramble times increase, morale erodes, initiative fades. By the end of 1944, Japan's air defense was no longer shaping the battle. It was responding to it. And while doctrine struggled to catch up, American planners were already looking forward. If altitude could neutralize fighters, what would follow if the bombers changed their method of attack? The answer would not be found in the skies above Japan. It would emerge from the cities below. By early 1945, American planners arrived at a troubling realization. High altitude had succeeded, but it was no longer the best answer. The original concept behind the B-29 campaign was precision. Bomb from extreme height, remain beyond interception, and dismantle Japan's industrial base step by step. On paper, the logic was clean. In reality, it ran into conditions no planning document had fully accounted for. Jet streams over Japan proved stronger than anticipated. Cloud cover was frequent and erratic. Accuracy declined. From 30,000 feet, even the sophisticated Norden bombsight could not consistently strike point targets. Entire formations executed textbook releases, only to see bombs drift far from their intended factories. Aircraft returned having burned fuel, stressed airframes, and delivered results that were difficult to measure. Altitude had denied Japan interception, but it had also denied the United States certainty. Meanwhile, Japan's air defenses, still largely ineffective, were adjusting in limited ways. Radar coverage improved slightly. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned. Interceptors experimented with night operations, head-on climbs, and specialized formations. None of this reversed the imbalance, but it reduced the margin. That reduction mattered. American commanders faced a decision: persist with a refined but inefficient approach, or accept higher risk to achieve decisive outcomes. They chose decisiveness. The change was profound. Instead of rising above Japan's defenses, B-29s would descend into them, flying lower, slower, and under cover of darkness. Altitude would no longer serve as the primary protection. Night would. This choice was not driven by confidence. It was driven by calculation. Japanese fighters, already strained at high altitude, were even less capable at night. Radar-guided interceptions were rare and poorly coordinated. Anti-aircraft fire lacked accuracy without visual cues. And Japan's cities, largely constructed of wood and paper, represented a vulnerability precision bombing had never fully exploited. Altitude had neutralized fighters. Fire would neutralize cities. For Japanese pilots, the shift was jarring. One night, bombers were distant silhouettes high above. The next, they were low-flying shapes moving through darkness, releasing incendiaries in vast patterns. The threat changed instantly. There was no single altitude to defend, no predictable interception window. Defense dissolved into disorder. Fighters scrambled too late or not at all. Ground crews struggled to refuel and rearm aircraft as nearby neighborhoods burned. Communications failed. Air raid warnings arrived seconds, sometimes minutes too late. The B-29 had transformed from an unreachable intruder into an ever-present one. Paradoxically, this shift highlighted the original failure even more starkly. Japan's air defense system had been built to defeat attackers it could see and reach. It now confronted bombers that required neither visibility nor altitude advantage to succeed. The psychological impact was severe. High-altitude bombing had bred frustration. Low-altitude night bombing bred terror. Pilots who once chased contrails now patrolled burning skies, uncertain where the next formation would emerge. The sense of order, the belief that air combat followed rules, collapsed entirely. There was no longer a correct response. Every defense was incomplete, delayed, or misdirected. It is essential to understand this transition accurately. Firebombing did not replace altitude as a weapon. It depended on it. High-altitude operations had already drained Japan's air defenses. Pilots were fatigued, aircraft were worn down, fuel supplies were thin, radar coverage was inconsistent. By the time B-29s descended, the system meant to stop them was already hollow. Altitude had done its work quietly. Fire only exposed the result. From the American perspective, the campaign revealed a harsh truth of modern warfare. Victory does not always come from destroying the enemy's weapons. Sometimes it comes from bypassing the logic that made those weapons relevant at all. Japan had prepared for interception. America had prepared for inevitability. As 1945 progressed, the skies over Japan became less a battlefield and more a corridor, one-way traffic delivering destruction with mechanical regularity. Fighters still rose, guns still fired, but the outcome was no longer uncertain. The war in the air had already been decided. What remained was the price, and in the next phase, that price would be measured not in aircraft lost, but in cities erased. By the spring of 1945, Japanese pilots were no longer asking how to stop the bombers. They were asking whether stopping them was still possible. The change had unfolded slowly, but without pause. Months of frustration at high altitude, followed by nights of destruction at low altitude, reshaped the mindset of Japan's air defense forces. What remained was not confusion about the threat, but a sharp awareness of their own limits. Japan did not lack bravery. It lacked choices. New orders came with growing urgency. Pilots were told to abandon conventional combat entirely. Instead of prolonged pursuit, they were directed to attempt single, decisive actions, head-on passes timed to the final seconds, steep climbs aimed at intercepting bombers just before release points, and, in the most extreme cases, intentional ramming. These actions were not born of blind desperation, as later narratives often suggest. They were logical responses within an untenable strategic position. Ramming was not selected because pilots wished to die. It was selected because it required no sustained engine power, no prolonged flight at altitude, and no return engagement. One climb, one approach, one impact. In a system starved of fuel, spare parts, and time, it was the only tactic that bypassed every constraint simultaneously. Even so, these measures failed to change outcomes. B-29 formations were large, layered, and robust. A single fighter, regardless of resolve, could not disrupt a formation quickly enough to stop bombs from falling. Even successful collisions often occurred after payloads had already been released. Destruction continued regardless. This revealed a deeper reality. Interception had lost its strategic relevance. Japan could still shoot down bombers. It could still damage aircraft. It could still kill crews. None of it altered the direction of the campaign. American planners recognized this imbalance clearly. Losses were logged, studied, and absorbed. Replacement crews arrived. Aircraft were repaired or replaced. Operations continued without pause. The system was built to withstand friction. Japan's was not. Each fighter lost represented months of training, precious fuel, and a pilot who could not be replaced. Each emergency scramble strained engines that could no longer be properly maintained. Each night mission consumed resources that would never be replenished. With every engagement, the gap widened. Japanese pilots began to internalize this truth. Diaries and post-war accounts show a shift from tactical thinking to existential awareness. The question was no longer how to win the air battle, but how long the nation could endure its consequences. Some pilots described the bombers not as opponents, but as mechanical inevitabilities, forces to be survived rather than defeated. This mental shift mattered more than any single encounter. Air defense depends on belief. Belief that effort matters. Belief that sacrifice changes outcomes. Belief that tomorrow can be better than today. By mid-1945, that belief was fading. Ground crews sensed it. Radar operators sensed it. Commanders issuing increasingly extreme orders sensed it. The system still functioned, but without confidence. Sorties were flown because orders required them, not because success was expected. And still, the bombers came. The tragedy lay in this. Japan's air defense did not fail because of incompetence or neglect. It failed because it was tasked with solving a problem it had never been designed to face. Doctrine assumed engagement. Technology assumed limits. Training assumed reciprocity. The B-29 violated all three. It did not seek engagement. It exceeded expected limits. It required no reciprocity at all. Seen in hindsight, this reframed the entire campaign. The decisive factor was not a single aircraft, engine, or weapon. It was a choice, the decision to fight in a dimension the enemy could not meaningfully contest. Altitude opened that dimension. Night expanded it. Scale closed it. By the time Japan's leadership fully understood the nature of the defeat in the air, nothing remained to adjust. Production was collapsing. Fuel was gone. Cities burned faster than they could be defended. The fighters still took off. But the war above Japan was already finished. What remained was not a struggle for control of the skies, but a reckoning with what happens when a nation's assumptions are rendered obsolete by an enemy willing to ignore them entirely. And in the final phase of the campaign, the bombers would no longer aim to break factories or defenses. They would aim to break time itself. By the summer of 1945, the campaign over Japan had reached a stage where traditional measures of success no longer made sense. Factories were damaged, but many had already been dispersed. Air defenses were active, but seldom effective. Interceptions still occurred, but they changed nothing. What the United States was now striking was not production alone. It was time. The logic was blunt. Japan's capacity to continue the war depended not only on weapons or territory, but on how long its remaining systems could function under constant pressure. Every night of bombing shortened that window. Every disruption magnified the next. Seen this way, the air campaign was no longer about gaining air superiority. That objective had already been achieved. It was about accelerating the inevitable. The B-29 force was ideally suited to this purpose. Its range allowed repeated strikes without pause. Its payload overwhelmed defenses through sheer volume. Its altitude and night tactics enabled operations with mechanical regularity. That regularity mattered. Japanese defenses had no time to recover between raids. Fire crews were exhausted. Repair teams worked under the constant threat of renewed attack. Transportation networks buckled under repeated disruption. Even raids that caused limited immediate damage produced severe cumulative effects. Cities did not need to be annihilated in a single night. They only needed to be prevented from recovering. Japanese leaders recognized the danger, but misunderstood its nature. Many still believed the bombing was preparatory, intended to weaken Japan ahead of invasion. Within that framework, endurance seemed meaningful. If the nation could hold out, political conditions might shift. Mediation might emerge, terms might improve, but the air campaign was not a prelude. It was decisive. By removing Japan's ability to control its skies, the United States created a situation where escalation required no negotiation, no buildup, and no warning. Each step forward was unilateral. Each new tactic could be applied at will. Japan could respond only after the damage was done. This imbalance reached its clearest expression in August 1945. Two missions, carried out by specially modified B-29s, revealed what absolute air dominance meant. They were not intercepted. They were not seriously challenged. They were not fully understood until after their missions were complete. These flights did not depend on altitude alone. They depended on the absence of resistance. Japan's air defense system, hollowed out by months of pressure without decisive engagement, could not oppose them. Fighters stayed grounded. Radar coverage was incomplete. The aircraft crossed Japanese airspace as though it were unguarded. The meaning was unmistakable. Air power had moved beyond the requirement to defeat an enemy's air force in battle. It had reached a point where preventing response was sufficient. Control of the sky had become control of escalation itself. For Japanese pilots, this realization came too late. Post-war accounts describe the final months not as a sequence of defeats, but as a steady erosion of agency. Nothing, no sortie, no sacrifice, no tactical adjustment seemed capable of altering the outcome. The war no longer felt competitive. It felt like a countdown. That sensation was deliberate. The United States had engineered it. By exploiting altitude early, American planners avoided costly attritional battles. By shifting to night operations, they neutralized remaining defensive advantages. By sustaining operational tempo, they denied Japan any real opportunity to adapt. Time became the enemy's most exposed weakness. This approach carried a lesson that would resonate for decades. Victory does not always require destroying an opponent's forces. Sometimes it requires placing them in a position where employing those forces no longer matters. Japan still possessed pilots, it still had aircraft, it still had guns. None of them could change what was approaching. Ultimately, the decisive moment of the air war over Japan was not a single battle or innovation. It was the moment Japan understood that its skies were no longer a realm of defense, but a channel through which outcomes were imposed. Altitude had opened that channel. Persistence had widened it. Time moved through it in only one direction. And when the war finally ended, it was not because Japan's air defenses were destroyed in a climactic confrontation. It ended because they had become irrelevant long before. By late July 1945, an unusual stillness hung over many Japanese airfields. Aircraft remained lined up. Pilots were still on rosters. Orders continued to circulate. Yet the sky above had become strangely vacant. Scramble alarms sounded less often, not because bombing had ceased, but because commanders increasingly doubted the value of launching fighters at all. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. Engines were breaking down at alarming rates. Spare parts were scarce or gone entirely. Every takeoff risked losing an aircraft permanently, even if it managed to return. In this atmosphere, caution replaced aggression. The reasoning was harsh but logical. Why burn fuel and aircraft on interceptions that experience had already proven pointless? Why sacrifice trained pilots in encounters that did nothing to slow destruction? In some areas, fighters were kept back for local defense or held in reserve for an invasion that might never occur. This hesitation marked a decisive shift. Air power depends fundamentally on initiative. Once initiative is relinquished, control follows quickly. By deciding when not to intercept, Japanese air defense surrendered the last remaining uncertainty to the attacker. American planners noticed at once. Reconnaissance flights met little resistance. Bomber crews reported fewer sightings of interceptors. Radar operators identified gaps, entire regions where fighter response had nearly disappeared. The airspace was no longer contested, it was managed. This lack of opposition did not stem from defeat in a single battle. It stemmed from exhaustion. Months of altitude denial, night attacks, and relentless operational tempo had pushed Japan's air defense beyond a breaking point. On paper, it still existed. In practice, it no longer shaped events. Decisions were now made entirely from one side. The air war had reached its final stage. For Japanese pilots, the quiet was deeply disturbing. Many later said it was worse than combat. In battle, there was clarity, enemy, movement, result. In waiting, there was only expectation, followed by distant detonations and fires on the horizon. Pilots heard reports of raids they could not challenge, knowing their participation would not have altered the outcome. This loss of purpose was as damaging as physical destruction. Air forces are defined by action. When action becomes optional or discouraged, the institution begins to unravel. Training loses meaning, discipline erodes, morale collapses inward. Yet this result had been set in motion long before. The decisive moment was not when fighters stopped flying. It was when altitude made their flight unnecessary. From the outset, the B-29 campaign had been designed to avoid a decisive air battle. There was no single engagement in which Japan's fighter force was shattered. No dramatic turning point. Instead, there was a slow, deliberate marginalization of an entire branch of the military. There was a stark elegance to this strategy. By refusing to fight on Japan's terms, the United States forced a choice between equally damaging options: scramble and waste resources for no effect, or stay grounded and concede the sky. Either path led to the same conclusion. The silence over the runways showed that the equation had resolved itself. As August neared, that silence enabled actions once unimaginable. Special missions flew without escort. Aircraft crossed Japanese airspace without meaningful detection or challenge. Interception, once the core of air defense, had faded into irrelevance. This condition was not only military, it was political. Air superiority at this scale stripped Japan's leadership of leverage. Without control of the skies, there could be no credible defense against escalation. Each new development, conventional or otherwise, arrived without warning and without response. The air war had removed choice entirely. Looking back, this explains the tone of many post-war Japanese accounts. They focus less on individual losses or battles and more on a growing sense of inevitability. The war did not feel lost all at once. It felt decided somewhere else, in a realm they could no longer reach. That realm was the sky, and in that sky, the outcome had already been settled. The final phase would now unfold quickly, not because Japan had suddenly collapsed, but because nothing remained to slow events. No resistance to absorb pressure, no defense to impose delay. The quiet was not peace. It was the sound of a war already finished, before the final decision was ever announced. When Japan finally moved toward surrender, the decision did not come as a sudden shock. It emerged from a reality that had already taken hold. By August 1945, Japan was no longer asking whether it could win the air war. That question had disappeared months earlier. What remained was a narrower, harsher debate: how long the nation could endure in a condition where the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. That distinction is important. Wars are rarely decided at the moment they formally end. They are decided when one side loses the ability to meaningfully shape events. For Japan, that moment arrived not with the final raids, but when air defense stopped imposing cost, delay, or uncertainty. From that point on, the outcome became procedural. American air power had achieved something uncommon: not merely dominance, but detachment. Bomber operations no longer responded to Japanese defenses. They were not testing reactions or adjusting tactics. They were executing established plans. Japan, meanwhile, was responding only to effects. Leadership discussions shifted toward damage reports rather than countermeasures. Briefings cataloged burned neighborhoods, disrupted transport, and displaced civilians, but offered little in the way of prevention. There were no new tactics to deploy, no reinforcements to summon, no dormant technologies waiting to change the balance. time itself had compressed. Each uncontested day under enemy-controlled skies reduced the distance to a final decision. Even those who hoped for negotiated terms understood the limitation. Negotiation requires leverage. Leverage requires the ability to impose costs or threaten escalation. Japan possessed neither. The air campaign had removed those tools methodically, not by destroying every aircraft or killing every pilot, but by making their use strategically irrelevant. Fighters that could not alter outcomes ceased to be instruments of policy. They became reminders of an earlier phase of the war. This explains the speed with which the end unfolded once it began. There was no sudden military reversal, no dramatic new revelation on the battlefield. Instead, a reality long in place was finally acknowledged. Continuing the war offered no route to improvement, only further deterioration. For Japanese pilots, this realization was deeply personal. Many later described the final days not as chaotic, but as starkly clear. The uncertainty that had defined earlier months, can we stop them today? Can we slow them tomorrow? Was gone. The sequence had become fixed. Bombers would come. Destruction would follow. Nothing could interrupt that order. That clarity, grim as it was, ended the illusion of agency. It is tempting to attribute this outcome solely to material imbalance. But inevitability is not produced by resources alone. It is shaped by decisions, by how power is applied and where. Japan had framed air combat as a contest of skill and courage. The United States framed it as a problem of physics, systems, and scale. That difference determined not only who controlled the sky, but how the war concluded. Altitude had been the opening move. Persistence had been the method. Irrelevance had been the outcome. By the time Japan's leaders confronted the final choice, the air war no longer entered the calculation. It had already been resolved. The question was no longer how to defend the country, but how to halt its destruction. This is the quieter truth often obscured by dramatic retellings. The war over Japan was not decided by a single night, a single weapon, or a single aircraft. It was decided when Japan lost the ability to contest the terms under which violence occurred. Once that ability disappeared, the conclusion followed with mathematical certainty. And when the guns finally fell silent, it was not because Japan's air defenses collapsed at the end. They had been bypassed at the beginning. What remained, for pilots, planners, and future generations, was the lesson of how decisively a war can be settled when one side chooses to fight in a space where the other cannot even stand. Long after the smoke had cleared, Japanese veterans found it difficult to explain what had disappeared first. It was not aircraft. It was not pilots. It was not cities. It was initiative. Before high-altitude bombing began, Japan's air defense still believed in reaction. There was confidence, strained but real, that detection would lead to interception, interception to engagement, and engagement to some degree of control. Even failure carried agency, the chance to try again, to adjust, to impose cost. Altitude broke that sequence. Once bombers operated beyond practical reach, reaction lost its meaning. Detection no longer led to response. Scramble orders no longer led to contact. Engagement, when it happened at all, no longer led to effect. The shift was quiet, but decisive. Commanders continued issuing orders because systems demand continuity. Fighters were still assigned sectors. Pilots were still briefed. But beneath the ritual, the logic was gone. Actions continued not because they might succeed, but because no alternatives remained. This is how systems collapse, not with violence, but with silence. The most damaging effect of altitude was not physical destruction. It was the loss of feedback. In effective warfare, actions generate results that guide the next decision. When results vanish, when effort produces no measurable impact, learning ends. Japan's air defense stopped learning. Every failed interception yielded no insight, only confirmation of limits. No change in timing, altitude, or formation improved outcomes. The enemy stayed unreachable, unchanged, indifferent. Over time, decision-making flattened. Commanders fell back on routine. Pilots fell back on procedure. Innovation requires hope. Altitude removed it. This explains why late-war adaptations, though numerous on paper, rarely mattered. New interceptors arrived too late. Engine modifications increased breakdowns. Tactics depended on conditions that no longer existed. Each response treated a symptom, not the cause. The cause was structural. The United States had turned the air war from interaction into exposure. Japan was no longer fighting an opponent, it was enduring a process. And processes do not bargain, hesitate, or tire. From the American perspective, this was the campaign's real achievement. The B-29 delivered more than bombs. It delivered predictability. Missions launched on schedule. Routes were planned without fear of interception shaping decisions. Adjustments were made for weather and logistics, not enemy action. Predictability multiplied power. When planners know what tomorrow will look like, they can decide what they want tomorrow to accomplish. Japan, lacking that certainty, could only react afterward. The imbalance grew daily. Japanese pilots sensed this even if they struggled to express it. Many described fighting the sky rather than an enemy. The bombers were distant, abstract, relentless. There was no duel to win, no maneuver to master, no moment of redemption. The war became impersonal. This mattered deeply for morale. Military forces rely on narratives of resistance, sacrifice, turning points. Altitude denied Japan those stories. There was no climactic interception, no decisive counterstroke, only repetition. Night after night, formation after formation, bombs falling with mechanical regularity. By the time Japan's leadership grasped the full meaning, the air war had already redefined defense itself. Defense no longer meant stopping attacks, it meant surviving them. That distinction carried enormous weight. A nation defending itself hopes to endure until conditions change. A nation merely surviving hopes only that the attacks end. Altitude forced Japan into the latter. This reframing explains why the final phase unfolded so quickly. Once air defense stopped providing leverage, events accelerated. Decisions that might once have been delayed or contested moved forward without resistance. There was nothing left to slow them. The sky no longer belonged to both sides. It belonged to the future. In hindsight, the lesson is clear. Military power is not only about numbers, strength, or bravery. It is about choosing where war is fought. By choosing altitude as the battlefield, the United States selected a domain Japan could see, but could not enter. Observation without influence is not control. It is resignation. And when resignation replaces initiative, war becomes a matter of timing, not chance. By the end of the summer of 1945, Japan's air defense had not been destroyed in a final clash. It had been emptied of purpose long before. Fighters still stood ready, pilots still waited, but the war they had trained for no longer existed in the sky they could reach. Altitude had taken it away. In many wars, people remember a single battle, the moment when everything changed. The air war over Japan never offered such a moment. There was no decisive interception over Tokyo Bay, no massive fighter clash that broke one side's strength, no final engagement where the outcome became suddenly clear. The decisive battle was the one that never happened. Japan had prepared for air war as an encounter, fighters meeting bombers, skill against skill, courage against courage. Training, doctrine, and expectation all pointed toward that moment of contact. Victory or defeat would be decided in the engagement itself. The United States removed the engagement. By choosing altitude early, American planners made the traditional air battle optional. By sustaining tempo, they ensured it stayed unnecessary. The result was a campaign in which Japan's air defense existed largely on paper, while the war advanced in reality without needing to confront it. That absence shaped everything that followed. Because there was no climactic battle, there was no moment of reversal. Defeat did not arrive as shock. It arrived as understanding, the slow recognition that the confrontation everyone had prepared for would never come, and that its absence was itself the defeat. Japanese pilots often describe this paradox. Years of training, combat experience, and hard-earned skill left them watching the decisive phase from the margins. The enemy was visible, audible, and lethal, yet never truly reachable. That condition is deeply destabilizing. A military can endure losses. It can endure setbacks. It can even endure defeat in battle. What it struggles to endure is irrelevance. Irrelevance drains effort of meaning. When sorties no longer shape outcomes, when courage no longer alters trajectories, the institution hollows from within. Actions continue, but belief fades. This is why Japan's air defense did not collapse suddenly. It dissolved. Aircraft remained parked beneath camouflage. Pilots still reported for duty. Orders were issued and acknowledged. But the animating purpose, the belief that interception mattered, had disappeared. American aircrews sensed the change instinctively. Late war mission reports describe a sky that felt unusually permissive. Threats were scattered, localized, rarely coordinated. Bombers were not slipping through defenses. They were flying over a system that had stopped contesting them in any meaningful way. This condition allowed escalation without friction. Once the enemy no longer shapes your decisions, escalation becomes routine. New tactics appear without fear of counteraction. New missions require no justification beyond logistics and weather. The war enters a phase governed by capacity alone. Japan could not compete in that phase. The absence of a decisive air battle also shaped memory after the war. Without a single defining engagement, it became tempting to explain defeat through isolated causes, specific weapons, particular raids, individual moments. But those explanations missed the deeper reality. The air war was decided by structure, not spectacle. Structure determines who sets the terms. Structure determines who acts and who reacts. Structure determines whether a battle must happen at all. By the time Japan understood that the battle it needed would never take place, recovery was no longer possible. There was no way to force the engagement back into existence. Altitude, night, and scale had closed that path completely. Seen this way, the final months of the war appeared differently. They were not the frantic end of a desperate struggle. They were the formal closing of a process already finished. The decisive moment was not a raid or a strike. It was a decision, made months earlier, to fight where the enemy could not respond. Everything else followed from that choice. In the end, the air war over Japan offers a stark lesson. Victory does not always come from destroying an opponent's strength. Sometimes it comes from declining to acknowledge it at all. The battle Japan needed never occurred. And because it never occurred, the war had already ended. When the war finally ended, no single explanation satisfied those who had experienced it firsthand. Japanese pilots searched for errors in their own actions. Commanders re-examined orders and deployment plans. Engineers revisited designs that had once promised solutions but fell short. Yet none of these answers fully explained the outcome. The uncomfortable reality was this: the air war was not lost because Japan chose the wrong tactics. It was lost because Japan had been asking the wrong question. That question was, how do we defeat the bomber? The answer, understood too late, was that defeat was never required. The United States did not need to destroy Japan's air defenses in battle. It only needed to make them unnecessary to confront. By operating beyond expected limits, first through altitude, then through time, then through scale, it transformed the conflict from confrontation into inevitability. That difference matters. Confrontation allows choice. Inevitability removes it. Once inevitability sets in, even sound decisions arrive too late. Adaptation becomes reactive rather than strategic. Innovation treats symptoms instead of causes. Effort increases, but influence shrinks. This pattern defined Japan's air defense in the final year of the war. Every attempt to regain relevance, new aircraft, revised tactics, urgent orders, was shaped by constraints the enemy no longer shared. The war had shifted onto a plane Japan could observe but not affect. By the time this became undeniable, the result was already determined. This is why so many post-war accounts emphasize confusion rather than defeat. Confusion is what remains when a war is decided somewhere else. Japanese pilots were not defeated in the traditional sense. They were displaced. The battlefield they had trained for vanished beneath them, replaced by one they could not enter. Skill, courage, and sacrifice endured, but without any means to convert them into effect. The sky itself had become asymmetrical. For those who came after, the lesson carried both warning and insight. Military institutions tend to prepare for the last war, perfecting what once worked, refining what once mattered. But wars are not won by refinement alone. They are won by redefining what is relevant. The B-29 campaign was not flawless. It suffered mechanical problems, weather disruptions, and operational uncertainty. Yet it succeeded because it forced the enemy to operate in conditions where imperfections no longer mattered. Japan's air defense was never granted the battle it required. And without that battle, there could be no recovery, no reversal, no dramatic turning point, only realization. The realization that the war in the air had ended not through defeat, but through displacement. The implications reached far beyond 1945. Every air force that later studied the campaign arrived at the same conclusion. Control of the sky is not simply about winning engagements. It is about deciding when engagements are optional. Whoever controls that decision controls the tempo of war, and ultimately, its conclusion. Altitude was the first expression of that control. Persistence made it enduring. Irrelevance completed the cycle. Japan learned this lesson at immense cost. And when the war finally ended, it was not because Japanese pilots stopped flying, nor because every fighter had been destroyed. It ended because the sky had already been lost in a way no sortie could undo. Only one question remained: how that loss would be remembered. That answer would not be found above Japan, but in the silence that followed. In the years after the war, the sky above Japan settled back into familiar quiet. Contrails disappeared, runways fell silent. Airfields once locked in constant readiness slipped into calm. Yet silence did not erase the lesson. For those who had experienced the war from cockpit glass and radar consoles, what lingered was not the memory of a final clash, but a realization, a moment of understanding that the war had moved past them, that the struggle they had prepared for no longer determined the outcome. Japan did not lose the air war in a single night. It lost it when the terms of the fight changed. Altitude was the first warning. When the B-29 began operating at heights where interception was impractical, it exposed a truth that would define modern warfare. Control of the sky does not require confrontation. It requires the ability to function where the enemy cannot respond in any meaningful way. Everything that followed, night missions, relentless tempo, escalation without warning, rested on that foundation. Japan's air defense did not fail because it lacked strength. It failed because it was built on reciprocity. It assumed that attack would provoke defense, that presence would invite response, that skill would meet counterskill. The B-29 campaign rejected those assumptions. Airspace became a medium, not a battlefield. Resistance became a variable to be reduced, not defeated. Time became a weapon, not a limitation. Once these principles took hold, outcomes no longer depended on bravery or ingenuity. They became structural. This is why the war ended without a final aerial confrontation. There was no last stand in the sky. No decisive interception to mark the conclusion. The question of control had already been answered long before the final decision was announced. In that sense, the silence that followed was more than peace. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the war had been settled at a level deeper than tactics or technology. It had been settled at the level of assumptions about where wars are fought, how power is applied, and what defense truly means. For those who came after, the lesson remains uneasy and enduring. The greatest defeats are not always dramatic. They do not always arrive with catastrophe. Sometimes they arrive quietly when relevance slips away unnoticed. Japan's pilots were capable. Its aircraft were formidable. Its defenses were active. None of it mattered once the war was fought somewhere else. The sky over Japan did not fall because it was overwhelmed. It fell because it was bypassed. That is the final reckoning of the B-29 campaign, not a tale of bombers and fighters, but of how wars can be won by refusing to fight the battle the enemy expects.